B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, December 5th, 2018. We've got an instant federal holiday today, as it was declared a national day of mourning due to the passing of George H.W. Bush, the 41st President of the United States. So the post office is closed and the stock market did not operate today, which is a relief to many investors since Trump's tweets caused an 800-point drop yesterday. And we're learning that the special counsel, Robert Mueller, is recommending a very light sentence, if any, for the brief national security advisor to the Trump administration, Michael Flynn. And Flynn was caught lying to the FBI 4 or 5 days into the new administration, led to his resignation, and he, we are told, has cooperated significantly with the special counsel. He apparently coughed it up early and honestly, and there are other investigations besides the Mueller inquest that Mike Flynn has contributed to, but most of that information is redacted from public view at this point. So we're told that Flynn has conducted 19 interviews with Mueller's office and that his early cooperation was particularly valuable. He was one of the few people with long-term and first-hand insight into the Russia investigation. And so it looks like he may get no jail time or maybe a couple of weeks. The recommendation is 0 to 6 months coming from special counsel Mueller. And what I find fascinating here is that the sentencing information, this document that was submitted to the court, and as I say, redacted version was made public, it mentions what I think is a much more egregious offense, because Mike Flynn is being convicted of one count of lying to the FBI, and the lie was about whether he spoke to Ambassador Kislyak and whether the discussion included the sanctions that the Obama administration had just imposed on Russia as Obama was headed out the door. But the bigger issue is that Mike Flynn openly violated the Foreign Agents Registration Act by accepting over $500,000 from a businessman on behalf of the nation of Turkey. And while he was an advisor to the Trump campaign, making public statements, he published an op-ed on Election Day itself. He was carrying water for the nation of Turkey and their long-term effort to get Fethullah Gulen transferred back to Turkish control. And as I mentioned Fethullah Gulen, I have to say that it amazes me that Rachel Maddow, who has covered this case many times, cannot bring herself to say even Gulen, much less Fethullah. And it's not that difficult, but she seems to choke on some of these non-American names, and she will talk about them as a guy, an imam, a mullah, but can't quite give his name. And Gulen, who has given only one interview since he moved to the United States, and Joe Lauria, who's now the editor at Consortium News, earned that honor, or that favor. Gulen is a Turkish cleric. He sits on millions, if not billions. He runs a charter school chain in the United States, and he is a murky figure who appears to be a CIA asset. And so we know that Mike Flynn held a meeting where James Woolsey, a former CIA director, was present, and he openly speculated about kidnapping Gulen and taking him to Turkey to collect a $15 million ransom. Now, the ransom may have been fanciful, or it may have been dangled by somebody. We don't know that detail. But as I mentioned, on Election Day in 2016, Flynn published an op-ed in The Hill calling Gulen a shady Islamic mullah and a radical Islamist. Now, prosecutors didn't charge Flynn with crimes related to that work and his failure to disclose it and his concealing information even when he made late filings under the Foreign Agent Registration Act. And as I say, that work that he did for Turkey which was stealthy, I think deserved a real punishment. Also, the Mueller information lays out that the real collusion that occurred in the period during the transition after the election and before the installation of Trump, the real collusion was on behalf of Israel. And they don't mention any contact directly from Israel to Mike Flynn. Apparently it went through Jared Kushner. Or maybe there was direct communication with Flynn. We just don't have those details published. But that collusion with a foreign nation, that interference in our politics, the interference that Israel conducted in the 2016 election, where Netanyahu came to Washington, gave a speech to a joint session of Congress, and made it very clear that he preferred Trump to Clinton. That was the foreign meddling that is available for all to see. But of course, Russia. And grounds for impeachment are there, as we've mentioned a dozen times, maybe a dozen times in the last week. The judge in the case in Maryland related to lawsuits based on the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution, challenging Trump's legal position regarding his Washington, D.C. hotel and the way foreign governments can buy favors from Trump by renting his hotel, hosting events there, those sorts of things. Well, Trump continues to battle it furiously. His lawyers filed a notice in court on Friday challenging the Maryland judge's decision to allow the case to move forward. They want to seek a writ of mandamus, trying to have the appeal heard by a higher court, but I don't think that is likely to be granted at this stage. We shall see. Meanwhile, the most desperate news occurring today is a report that the world's greenhouse gas emissions are rising at a faster pace this year than they did last year. The latest evidence that planet-warming pollution is proliferating again after a kind of flat line in the middle of the decade. The trend is accelerating the Earth's collision course with some of the most severe consequences of climate change. That's the warning from scientists. Worldwide, carbon emissions are expected to increase by 2.7% this year. They went up 1.6% last year. Scientists say this puts the world on track with the highest emissions trajectory modeled by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN group. That group issued an alarming report in October, saying that if emissions continue to rise at the current rate, the planet would warm 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels by 2040, and it's possible that that could accelerate, and we could reach that level by 2030. That's only 12 years from now. The rise in emissions has been driven primarily by stronger demand for natural gas and oil. We have seen oil use go up 5 years in a row, said a professor of Earth System Science, Rob Jackson. That's really surprising. We thought we'd hit peak oil 15 years ago. The cheap gasoline prices, bigger cars, and people driving more miles are boosting oil use at rates that were not expected. And meanwhile, with this in view, the group called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, they are busy trying to promote legislation that would add even more carbon emissions to our atmosphere. They met in Washington last week, state lawmakers and corporate lobbyists. They voted for a slate of anti-environment measures, resolutions supporting stripping tax benefits from electric vehicles, endorsing Trump's pro-fossil fuel energy agenda, and they voted down a proposal to limit monopoly control of the power industry. Now, you know about ALEC. They curry favor with state-level legislators. And it's insidious what they've been able to achieve with model bills. Like the Stand Your Ground bill in Florida that's been copied in many states. And there are numerous other examples. And so it shows how corporate influence controls policy to a dangerous degree in this country today. And this is happening in Georgia, too, where there is a special election, a runoff, to decide who will serve on the obscure state agency, the panel called Georgia's Public Service Commission, the PSC. That is the group that is supposed to regulate the power industry. But it's very clear it's the other way around. They are captive to the industry they're supposed to be regulating. And so the Southern Company, which owns Georgia Power, is connected to a political committee called Georgians for a Better Future, and the powerful trade group called the Nuclear Energy Institute is pumping money through a lobbying group called Nuclear Matters into Georgians for a Better Future, and they're spending $1 million to try to hold on to this one guy's seat on the Public Service Commission. And get this, the Democrat who opposes him is not opposed to nuclear energy. There are 2 nuclear power plants that are way over budget and way behind schedule that the Georgia utilities, Southern Company and Georgia Power, are determined to complete. And they are determined to stiff the ratepayers with the cost overruns. And we saw this happen in California with the rogue utility PG&E and the cost overruns at the Diablo Canyon twin nuclear reactors. So this is a playbook that the nuclear industry and the utilities have used before. So there are 2 reactors being built at the Vogtle site, V-O-G-T-L-E. They've already got $8.3 billion in federal loan guarantees, but there are billions in cost overruns. And the Democratic candidate, Lindy Mueller, is not an opponent of nuclear energy. She supports continued construction of the Vogtle plant. Her difference is she doesn't want the ratepayers to pay for it. She thinks the shareholders of the Southern Company and Georgia Power should foot the bill. Oh, it's disgusting. All the way around, it's disgusting. Meanwhile, in Georgia as well, the runoff election for state attorney for chief vote suppressor has gone to the Republican Brad Raffensperger. He defeated former Congressman John Barrow to become the top elections official, and that office was vacated by Brian Kemp after he rigged his own election as governor in the midterms. Over in West Virginia, Joe Manchin is the senator who survived his midterm re-election after voting for Brett Kavanaugh. He also supported Neil Gorsuch for the Supreme Court and votes with the Republicans as often as he possibly can. And to his credit, the governor of Washington State and former Congressman Jay Inslee is launching a petition to demand that Senate leader Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader, block Manchin from serving as the ranking Democrat on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Says Inslee, Senate Democrats must not allow Joe Manchin to become the ranking member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. I need your help to stop this. On climate, he's simply wrong. Now, I did a quick Google search on Joe Manchin and coal. And before he entered elective office, he was previously the governor of West Virginia. In 2009, he reported an income of $1.36 million from EnerSystems, a coal brokerage company that he helped run before he got into politics. His next disclosure showed a drop in pay to only $400,000 in the year or 2 following. Now, Joe Manchin says that his coal holdings in EnerSystems are in a blind trust. How blind is it if you know what kind of coal is in that stocking? And Joe Manchin is a longtime supporter of the coal industry, and he doesn't have any place on that energy committee. Over in Wisconsin, the lame duck battle by Republicans who are going to lose the governorship and the attorney general's post. They retain control of the state legislature, and so they're ramming through bills that will significantly reduce the power of the incoming Democratic governor, whose name is Tony Evers, and the attorney general, whose name I don't have in front of me here. At any rate, they were successful. There were protests and a late night or all-night session. But earlier today, the Republicans pushed through the sweeping set of bills. Katrina Shankland, a Democrat, said that's what this is about, power-hungry politicians using their grubby hands in their last-ditch effort to desperately cling to power. All we've seen demonstrated today and over the past few days is a contempt for the public. And that's very true. These are Republicans trying to use undemocratic methods to limit the power of their successors. And this happened in North Carolina in the past. And this shows the bare-knuckle tactics and the kind of evangelical belief that Republicans have that their conservative policies are, I guess, God-given or inspired by the God they believe in, and that these secular Democrats will only ruin everything. And so we have to infantilize them by building in idiot-proof systems to prevent these dangerous, desperate liberals from imposing the liberal virus that Scott Walker thinks he has cleansed from the body politic in the Badger State. Then we go to North Carolina, where the investigation into the voting irregularities in the Congressional District 9 contest between Republican Mark Harris and Democrat Dan McCready decided by less than 1,000 votes, 905. And we know that there is significant chicanery with vote by mail, absentee ballots, many of which were managed by a guy named McCrae Dowless. And Dowless earned over $500,000, it looks like, to serve on various campaigns, and he did a lot of what is viewed as tampering with these absentee ballots. So he ran an operation where he hired a bunch of people starting in the summer, and the insiders say, wow, this was quite an operation. Jessica Dowless, who is the stepdaughter of McCrae Dowless, said that she worked in for Harris for the last 2 months. The campaign was chaotic. One worker was so fucking high the other day she passed out of the fucking computer. So the talk is of loose cash, of payoffs of cars and a van to people who agreed to work for this McCrae Dowless. They violated the law repeatedly by picking up sealed absentee ballots and then acting as the witness to signatures that they were not present for. And by handling these mail-in ballots, they violated North Carolina law, which doesn't permit third parties to be involved. So this appears to be a very serious scandal, and it remains to be seen how the authorities in North Carolina will resolve it. Every day I pause for a moment to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. The fine folks at DGL Engraving, they've been on board for years now. Jim McHugh gives $5 a month. Julie Dupree, Andrew Harnack, they kick in $10 a month each. What can you do for me today? He asked. Well, you can take out a new subscription. I would be delighted if you do. Just visit peterbcollins.com, click on menu, click on Become a Subscriber. You land on the sign-up page, and it's easy to use PayPal to choose a level of support that fits your budget. And if you're allergic to PayPal, you can hit me at Box 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. And for new annual subscribers, $50 and a mailing address in the U.S., I've got the bonus gift, the rock and roll CD by John Dist called American University. Theresa May is in deeper trouble now as she tries to win the battle of Brexit. And the Prime Minister of Britain took 2 defeats yesterday, and one of them has never happened before. Lawmakers delivered an historic rebuke, finding her conservative government in contempt of Parliament for refusing to publish the advice it had received from the country's top law officer about the Brexit deal. That vote was 311 to 293. And if that's any predictor of the divide on the Brexit package itself, that suggests that Miss May does not have the vote she needs to prevail. And the question I have to raise here again, maybe some of our listeners in the UK can help me out here, but as I understood it from Andy Worthington and others, the original Brexit referendum was advisory. It was not binding. And so I believe going back to the people for a vote, one that could be binding, would make sense at this stage. Of course, I'm one of those colonists who has no standing to advise the government of Great Britain, and so I will stand down. So as I mentioned, today is this kind of instant federal holiday. The post office is closed and government offices are closed and the stock market didn't operate. And it's actually good because Trump may have been tweeting about China again. I'm not sure. I don't follow every one of his tweets. But the closure of the market prevents, at least for a few hours, further deterioration in the value of equities here in the U.S. 800 points, 3+% lost yesterday. And it's all attributed to the confusion that Trump generated by falsely claiming that he had a deal with China's Xi Jinping. And as the news filtered out that he had been lying again, Tariff Man said, "Oh, no, we have very strong signals from the Chinese government that they're going to come through for us. I believe President Xi meant every word of what he said at our long and hopefully historic meeting," Trump wrote in a tweet. In a separate tweet, he pointed to a Bloomberg report that Chinese officials were preparing to restart imports of American soybeans and liquefied natural gas, but nobody is able to confirm that at this time. And here is a power quote from Ian Shepherdson at Pantheon Macroeconomics. Both the sentiment of the tweets, the president called himself Tariff Man, and the profound lack of understanding of economics they demonstrated were deeply alarming. And, of course, the National Day of Mourning heaps a lot of false praise and unearned accolades on the 41st President, George Herbert Walker Bush. And last summer, I was in Maine, just 10 miles from the Bush compound at Kennebunkport. So I drove by and took a look. And it's a beautiful spot. But it symbolizes the inherited power of the Bush family. Because they were upper crust, because this guy's dad was a United States senator and a banker. Poppy Bush went into public service, and we've heard all about it, starting as a Republican chair in Houston, then going into Congress. He was the Republican National Committee chair. He was ambassador to China, ambassador to the UN. And many of us believe that he was a CIA operative. Questions remain about where he was and why he was in Dallas on November 22nd. 1963, when JFK was assassinated. And today, Craig Unger published at The Guardian a kind of good palliative to ease the gag reflex that you get from watching all this hagiography as the funeral proceedings continue. And Craig Unger, who wrote a book about, what was his book? House of Bush, House of Saud. Well, he makes the connection that it was George W. Bush in the 1980s who was tasked by the CIA director Bill Casey, because Ronald Reagan didn't really do anything, to make a peace tour of the Middle East, where, Unger writes, Bush's true objectives were exactly the opposite. He was there to escalate the war between Iran and Iraq. Specifically, he was tasked with delivering strategic military intelligence to Saddam Hussein so that Iraq would intensify its bombing inside Iran. After a series of brutal air attacks, Bush and Casey reasoned Iran would be forced to turn to the U.S. for missiles and to complete the bizarre notion of the Iran-Contra exchange. And 48 hours after Bush executed his mission, Iraqis launched hundreds of strikes targeting oil facilities deep inside Iran. And I'll also note that I have seen the documents. Somebody leaked them to me back in the early 90s, where George W. Bush signed off on the exchange of agricultural credits for cash that could be used to buy weapons, and all that to the benefit of the repressive government in Baghdad. Then Trump went on to profiteer. Oh, I called him Trump. Bush went on to profiteer from his connections to the Saudis and to the war machinery, becoming an officer of the Carlyle Group, the private equity firm heavily funded by Saudi billionaires. And that connection That bloody connection continues to this day as we see the impunity served up for the murderous Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Joe Biden says that Joe Biden is the most qualified person to be president. Thanks, Joe. Go home, will you? We don't need any retreads. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced yesterday, the Trump administration will begin the formal process to bail out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty. But first, they are going to give Russia the opportunity to comply with the treaty, and if 60 days go by, they will move to formally dissolve the agreement. Ray McGovern has a good piece at Consortium News today. A little preview of James Comey's secret testimony that will be redacted and then partially released before the House, I think it's the Judiciary Committee this Friday. And they have jurisdiction over the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And I would like to see a full-throated investigation of the FISA court. I believe that the agencies that seek warrants from it routinely lie to it, and I base that on the outrage expressed by many of the hardcore judges who have sat on the FISA court and publicly, or at least in the reports, accused the NSA in particular of repeatedly lying to the court. But this is about whether the FISA court and Carter Page were the origins of the Trump-Russia investigation that was launched at the FBI while James Comey was still the boss there. And McGovern has some good comments about the nature of this, how Trump is really only interested in Trump, and so he doesn't get involved in the deeper issues here, and McGovern suggests that's at Trump's own peril. So it's an interesting piece, and I encourage you to check it out. I've put up the link to the Consortium News article in the show file at peterbcollins.com. Over in Arizona, Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who got a pardon from Trump, is no longer running the sheriff's office there in Phoenix. And the new guy is a well-intentioned fellow named Paul Penzone. He's made some changes, including an admission on the agency website that its officers previously engaged in racial profiling. But even after a 5-year monitoring by the Justice Department and compliance costs of $90 million, the latest audit of traffic stops in Maricopa County concluded that Latinos and other minorities are treated differently than whites. Still, it found, for example, the average length of stops for Hispanic drivers is 3 minutes longer than that for white drivers, and we don't know about the ticketing or other outcomes of those traffic stops. Facebook is now being pilloried by a British parliamentary committee, releasing documents that show how Facebook gave favored companies like Airbnb, Lyft, and Netflix special access to users' data in a period between 2012 and 2015, while Facebook was under an SEC consent decree or an order of some sort. Facebook entered into agreements with select companies to allow them access to data after they made policy changes that restricted access for others. And finally today, the New York Times got a leaked draft copy of the report of the investigation of the disgraced CBS chairman and chief executive Les Moonves. And they conclude that he destroyed evidence, misled the investigators in an attempt to preserve his reputation and salvage a $120 million severance deal in his contract. The report says that Moonves engaged in multiple acts of serious, non-consensual sexual misconduct inside and outside of the workplace before and after he came to CBS in 1995. The report includes previously undisclosed allegations of sexual misconduct. The lawyers said that Moonves talked to them 4 times. They found him to be evasive and untruthful and to have deliberately lied about and minimized the extent of his sexual misconduct. And, one of the things that is the elephant in the room here is in his executive suite at Black Rock, that's CBS headquarters in New York, Les Moonves had a private bedroom. And this report indicates that there was one female employee who was kept on the payroll who was on call to give him a blowjob whenever he asked for it. And so this had to be known to other people at CBS. And so I have to believe that Moonves is not the beginning and end of the problems there. Investigators found that Moonves received oral sex from at least 4 CBS employees under circumstances that sound transactional and improper, to the extent that there was no hint of any relationship, romance, or reciprocity. Wow. That's really sordid stuff. I mean, on porn movies, they often have somebody there to orally stimulate the male actors when, they start to get a little soft.
Come on, lighten up out there.
All right. And one more comment from you, Poppy?
We're trying to contain this.
Yeah, good luck. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the dang place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.